Okay, thank you, Sudipta. So this is sort of the last of the 10 lectures, and before getting into the main part of the lecture, let me first thank my collaborators with whom I have worked extensively for at least this lecture, what I'm going to talk about. So this is Bhaskar Mukherjee, who is now a postdoc at ICTS, moving to England soon, COVID permitting. And then Shourabh Mundi, who was Arnab's student. Arnab is a colleague from that at IACS, and Dipti Manda, of course, my longtime collaborator. And most of the things that I'm going to talk about today has been done in collaboration with these people, and particularly Bhaskar, who has been doing all the numerics for these projects. Okay, so with that, let me try to come back to this. Okay, let's see. Okay, things are frozen, it seems. Let me try to. Okay, very strange. Let me stop share and share again, because it looks like that things are frozen. So, oops. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, now it's working. Fine, great. So now the first thing that I'm going to do today is to talk about a bit of experiments with this Rydberg chain, one particular experiment which has kickstarted this whole field of this dynamics of Rydberg chain, which is currently a hot topic. So let me try to tell you what these experiments are. Okay, so first of all, the atoms that people are using for this kind of chains are 87 rubidium atoms. And the ground state of these atoms corresponds to the F equal to 2 and 5s of orbital. So for people who are adept at atomic optics, this is a complicated enough atom, and so it just turns out that if you know how to do all these atomic physics calculations, you would find that the atoms prefer to sit at the 5s of level with F equal to 2. And F is the total angular momentum quantum number. Okay. And it's also perfectly polarized because it's in the state NF equal to -2. Okay. And then these atoms have another state which is shown in this figure B called R. So G is the ground state, and then there is this R, which is essentially the excited state. Okay, so it's called the Rydberg state. And the reason it's called, the reason it's important is that once you can pump the atoms from the ground to the Rydberg in one way or the other, they are metastable. So they live in this state for a very, very long time. Okay, and the details of this are all there in atomic physics literature, but I'm not going to get into that. Partly because it's not a part of this course, and partly because, quite frankly, I don't understand the whole details. Okay, so that's the idea. So how do you do this? So essentially, you get these atoms into the ground state, okay, and then turn on lasers. So you turn on two lasers with frequencies omega b and omega r, and put such that there is a fine detuning, small delta, between this intermediate state. And this intermediate state is the way you drive the atoms from the ground to the excited state. So it's a two-state transition in some sense. And this omega that you have is essentially, the product of this omega b and omega r divided by delta. Okay, so that's calculated within some orders in perturbation theory. But essentially, this omega gives you the amplitude of pumping a Rydberg atom from its ground to the Rydberg state, okay, by some complicated atomic physics techniques. But why is this so important? It is important because once the atoms are in this Rydberg state, they have a very strong dipole-dipole interaction with any other atom which is also in a Rydberg state. Okay, so typically, imagine that you have an atom at this site on a Rydberg state. There is a Rydberg excitation here. then if you try to put a Rydberg excitation on the next site, for example, you have to pay a very high energy cost, and this is modeled typically by Vij, which is a tunable parameter in the experiments. Okay, so this gives you the, so basically there are three ingredients here. The first one is that you can pump atoms to this Rydberg state, and the second one is that if you do pump an atom to a Rydberg state, then any other atom which needs to be pumped to the Rydberg state sees a huge potential, and this potential is quite substantial. It can be larger than all other effective energy scales of the problem. And also, there is this third thing called the detuning parameter, delta, which tells you how you adjust this frequency omega r out here. You don't adjust it right to the Rydberg state. You keep a small detuning. That is, you can keep it a little above or below the Rydberg state. So keeping it above means this delta is negative in my notation, and keeping it below means delta is positive. Okay. So this essentially tells you that the low energy stuff for these Rydberg atoms contains a detuning parameter, because if delta is 0, then okay, so contains a detuning parameter and then an interaction between these atoms. Okay, and then also there is a probability that an atom goes directly from the ground to the Rydberg state, excited state. Okay. So is this part clear? Any questions? Anything which is unclear? So now, if this is clear, let me introduce a concept called Rydberg blockade. So what happens is that, depending on how strong this V is, and I already said that it's a tunable parameter, what you can do is that you can basically tune it in such a way that if you excite an atom at, let's say, at the site I out here, then exciting another atom at a distance from this I up to a radius, let's say capital R, is going to cost you a very large energy. Okay, so as far as you don't do anything drastic to the system, as far as you are in the low energy sector, there is a blockade, so that if you have one Rydberg excitation on any one site, up to a few sites around that site, you cannot have another. Okay, because it's energetically too costly. Okay, and this radius is known as the Rydberg blockade radius. Okay, and this is used to prepare states in the system. Okay, now.
So Krishna,
yeah,
there was a small question. I think at some point I couldn't hear you well. Something happened. So when you're explaining, so what is this Z2 state? What do you mean by this Z2?
No, I haven't explained this yet. Let me come to
that. Okay, because I thought it came in that.
Yeah, no, I haven't covered it yet. So let me come to this. Okay, okay. So now imagine. Let me explain what these sigmas and m's are. The sigma essentially is an the amplitude. Okay, so it just tells you that if you are initially in the ground state, after this term acts on your Hamiltonian, you are in the Rydberg state. So it's like ground, kid ground, and the blah Rydberg, things like that. Okay, it's just an amplitude of moving from the ground state to the Rydberg state. Then essentially it just tells you that. What is the energy cost? It's like a chemical potential. What's the energy cost of putting an creating a Rydberg excitation? And V tells you that if you have created two Rydberg excitations at site I and J, what's the energy cost that you pay for that? Okay, it's the interaction energy. Okay, so this is roughly the atom, and roughly the Hamiltonian, and this essentially this M. Can also be thought as the Z component of a fictitious spin, so that n is equal to 1 is sigma z equal to 1, that is spin up, and n equal to 0 is sigma z equal to down, that is -1, that is spin down. Okay, so people typically move from one language to the other, and therefore, and the sigma x can be written as b plus b dagger, where you could create or destroy a Rydberg excitation. Okay, that's the typical thing. Now, if I give you this Hamiltonian and I try to tell you that, well, what is the ground state of this system? Okay. Now, imagine that this delta is large compared to omega. Okay. So forget about this term. Then the rest of these two terms are quite classical. You see, it's all n, and therefore you can really see what the ground state is. Also here, first imagine that V is 0. Okay, there is no interaction between the Rydberg atoms. Sorry. Oops. What happened? Yeah. So imagine that there is no interaction between the Rydberg atoms. Then, if delta is greater than 0, you want to produce as many Rydberg excitations as possible. Okay. So for delta greater than 0, you are going to have all Rydberg excitations. However, that's not a very good state if Vij is there, okay, because you're going to pay too much interaction energy cost. And in experiments, people use this fact to tune this Vij. So they can tune it in a regime where the nearest neighbor atoms cannot be in the Rydberg state. That is saying that your Rydberg blockade radius is 1 atom, or you can have 2 atoms or 3 atoms and stuff like that. And they're very good at tuning it, and they can precisely get this values. So imagine that now your Rydberg blockade radius is 1, okay, just 1 atom. Then, and this delta is positive, then you still want to produce as many Rydberg atoms as you want. However, you don't want to do it at 2 consecutive sites. So then the ground state is 1 Rydberg excitation, then the next atom is at ground state, then another Rydberg excitation, the next atom is again at ground state, and so on. So you have a pattern of 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, etc. And that state is called the Z2 state. It's typically because it's called an antiferromagnetic state in the spin language. Okay. So, Prasanna, is that clear?
It's actually clear from the spin language, but there is a little bit of a subtlety from the atomic physics side, which I'm worried about, which is in principle, this is off detuned driving of an atom. So you're saying from with the driving, it doesn't matter if I detune red or blue. If I'm far detuned, it is harder to produce an excited state.
That's right.
So in principle, I understand this. If you remove the driving, yes, so you're moving the position of the atoms around. But in the atomic physics, this intuition is a little bit.
No, because all of this has a finite lifetime, because that is something I'm not addressing because I have thrown.
I'm not even thinking of finite lifetime. The point is that the detuning itself makes sense only when the driving is there, right? Because
but the driving is there. This is an effective Hamiltonian.
Correct.
Okay, so you go into this language of. Sorry, just one second.
Sure.
Yeah. So basically, you just go into the language of this, this what do you call atom plus photon language.
Right.
Treat the whole thing, and this is effectively your effective Hamiltonian in the low energy sector, as far as I understand it.
Correct. No, I agree that this Hamiltonian is correct. So what I was wondering is, like, for example, if I'm driving with this omega I by 2 weak, right? So that's when this, for example, this saying that omega 0 makes sense when omega is smaller than delta I. That is where you're discussing the ground state now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So in this limit, if I have a weak and far detuned drive, it really should not matter whether the detuning is positive or negative. You will still not be able to get enough excited states.
Yeah, but the point is that this omega I is only the effective parameter. You see, the drive frequencies are this omega R and omega whatever this other thing is.
Subdivided by delta. Yeah.
Yeah. So those are large parameters compared to the drive frequency. However, what you do is that you adjust the small delta, and this omega is omega R times omega I divided by the small delta.
Right.
That can be a small parameter compared to delta I.
Okay. Fine. Yeah. No problem.
You are absolutely correct. If either omega R or this other thing is small, then you cannot get into this rhythm.
Right. Okay. No problem.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, fine. So let's then go into this. So then as you tune your interaction range and you tune this detuning, so to speak, the chemical potential, you can get into a regime where you have this Z2 order state, which is this sort of antiferromagnetic state. But if you now increase the interaction so that your radius of blockade also increases, when it goes to two sides, you get this Z3, and they have gone up to Z4 as far as I understand. Okay. So you can get these symmetry broken states, which was one of the things that, if you remember the last class, we were getting at. And this was very nicely obtained in this kind of Rydberg atom experiments. But the thing that people essentially got a surprise from, and what kickstarted this whole field of driven Rydberg system, is that they did the following experiment. So they started essentially from a disordered part, which means that your detuning is negative, so that the system is at the ground state, let's say. Your detuning is positive and the system is at one of these Z2 ordered state, and then you suddenly quench. Okay, you quench this detuning such that you are in the disordered state, and you see how the system evolves. Okay, so in fact, in the experiments, they quench exactly at the 0 point, where the detuning delta over omega is 0, and then they look at how this system evolves. Okay. So what they found is that, okay, so what do you expect? You expect that because this is a strongly interacting system, okay, what you expect essentially is that these oscillations that you can think will come because of this, so the quantum oscillations, they are going to die out very fast, and the system is going to reach a steady state. That's the typical thing that you expect when you see long-time dynamics in an interacting system. And I'm going to sort of qualify this statement a bit later. But what they saw instead is that the evolution essentially consists of long-time oscillations, okay? And these times are of the order of microseconds, which is very, very long compared to system timescale. So this is, in terms of typical system timescale, this is almost order of 100 cycles. T is equal to 100 in those units. Okay, and typically in this kind of systems, you basically expect a steady state to come within t equal to of the order 5 at most. So these are really, really long lived, and it doesn't really matter in some sense that how many atoms that you keep in. So it's not really a finite size effect of some such. And this is in violation of a principle that typically people believe is true in this kind of driven systems, and I'm going to come to that. It goes by the name of ETH, or Eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. But before that, so that point about this experiment is that twofold. One is that it produced some very interesting states out here, and the second one is that it saw these long time oscillations, whose the reason for which was not clear at that point. Okay, so any questions? Okay, so let's try to.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So in the previous slide, what is this domain wall density?
Oh, this is some. Okay, so what they can find out in experiment is that this Rydberg atoms. Okay, so find out this Rydberg atoms density. Okay,
so this pattern
turns out to be some domain wall density in the spin language.
So this pattern, this antiferromagnetic pattern, like up, down, up.
Not actually. This is yes, of course. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
So, but just to point this out, that it's not that you are going to see this only if you look at this domain wall density. Any correlation function, any local correlation function of the system, which starts from this. For example, you can just consider a density correlator, two sides apart, which is the most local thing that you can think of in this Z2 order state. is also going to see this kind of pattern. So you can think of it as in some sense of density correlation.
I see.
Or density for that matter. That is also going to be. So here are some key concepts which will probably explain why this result is surprising. The first of these is eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. So the question that people have been asking for a long time is that suppose I take a quantum state in a non-integrable many-body system, which is not an eigenstate. So you prepare the state in whatever way you want to, and then I let it evolve according to some Hamiltonian, such that the initial state is of course not an eigenstate of the Hamiltonian. So the question is, what do you expect for what do you expect for a typical local operator? How would it behave under such dynamics? Okay. So the answer to this question requires understanding the properties of matrix element of these local operators between any two eigenstates of the system. Okay, and the reason for this is that once you know this matrix element, you can always expand in the eigenbasis of the Hamiltonian, and you can sort of see how it would look up. Okay, so when people looked into the properties of this matrix element, they came up with a conjecture, and this is done in the 90s and a long time before all this Fouquet stuff came in, and it goes by the name of eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. And it's a conjecture, it's not proven yet. It says that for sufficiently local operators, these matrix elements are going to be roughly diagonal in the eigenbasis. Okay, and this diagonal value would be given by the microcanonical ensemble value of this expectation with some average energy which is given by Em plus Em by 2. So it's roughly the energy of the state. Okay. On top of that, there would be an additional piece which is off diagonal, but that is going to be exponentially suppressed, where here S is the total entropy of the system, and because this is extensive, this thing is exponentially suppressed. So at long times and for large enough system in the thermodynamic limit, everything is diagonal. And if you basically consider a temperature which is obtained from this average energy, okay, then you could say the system goes into a steady state where whose temperature, which is thermal, and whose temperature is given by the average energy, E bar. Okay, so kBT is E bar, and that's your average energy. So once you take this conjecture, you can compute the long time expectation value of anything, and it turns out it's just given by the microcanonical ensemble value. Okay, this is something that there is a review article by Marcus Strigl, Anatoly Polkovnikov, and others, and which I'm going to send. And this has been, there are quite a few points, all details, which I am not going to get into. But the point is that this is now a very well-known conjecture in the field. And for most cases, for non-integrable models, we see that this is really true. Okay. So what does that mean? It means, so what does this mean? That it means that once we know that this ETH holds, then I can make certain predictions about the properties of this long time value. So now with this, you can understand that why this oscillation that we found in the Rydberg atom was surprising, because according to ETH, everything should, so at long times, everything should go to a constant value, which should be predicted by this ETH, and which is the microcanonical ensemble. So oscillations would die and everything would become flat, okay, with a value which is given by this microcanonical ensemble value, and that didn't happen. Okay, so that was a surprise. So then people started asking that, look, is this ETH sacrosanct, or can it be violated at places? And it is known that ETH can be violated. So first of all, if you have integrable models, for example, ETH can be violated because in the integrable models, there are a lot of conserved quantities that you have, a thermodynamic number of them. And therefore, once the system starts to evolve, these conserved quantities do not let it explore the full phase space. Okay, so you have loss of ergodicity, and there is no long-term thermal steady state. The steady state is not given by simply a temperature, and it's not thermal. Okay. So that is one way of violating this, but clearly it doesn't apply to the system of Rydberg atoms. The second thing, which again is a violation due to destruction of ergodic nature of your many-body Hamiltonian, comes from a state of matter called many-body localized state. So this phenomenon of many-body localization is that this is basically when you have very strong disorder in your sample. Then what happens is that the state becomes completely localized. All the states in the Hilbert space become effectively localized. And as a result, what happens is that the system does not move in the Hilbert space during evolution, and you have loss of ergodicity, and NMDL is violated. So this possibility is also ruled out because these Rydberg atoms are not disordered. Okay. The third possibility which came up, and in fact it came up because of these experiments, is that there could be a weak violation of ETH, which may come when you have a special class of eigenstates in the Hilbert space, and these are called quantum scars, and I'm going to explain what these are and why these are special. But these scars essentially are anomalous eigenstates, and they don't mix with most of the eigenstates in the near Hilbert space. So what happens is that if you start from an initial state, which has large overlap with the scars, but not so large overlap with other states in the Hilbert space, the dynamics essentially proceed by moving within the scar subspace. And because it doesn't permeate in the Hilbert space, you don't see this thermalization or ergodicity, and therefore you can have long-time coherent oscillations, and you do not reach a thermal steady state. Okay, so this is indeed what happens in this Rydberg state.
So in the previous slide, what is denoted by this F suffix O? What?
Which one? Sorry.
So in this expression of the matrix element of OM, yes.
Well, okay, so this is a function which tells you the amplitude of the off-diagonal term, okay? And this can be written in terms of the expectation of this operator, etc. RMN, so see that you are taking expectation value with respect to two eigenstates. So it's a matrix element with respect to two eigenstates, N and N, okay?
Yes.
So there is a energy difference between these two states, which is this omega, and there is a average energy, which is this En plus En by 2, which is E bar. Okay, so your diagonal terms only depend on E bar, well, according to ETH, and this off-diagonal term depends both on E and omega, and this function needs to be computed explicitly for specific operators. It's not a universal function.
Okay. Also for systems, also like for different systems, it can be.
Yeah. It's going to depend.
It's non-universal.
The operators that you calculate.
It's non-universal.
Yeah, it's non-universal.
And in this time average statement, so this ETH is only valid for time average of this observable, or like at any time.
ETH is valid irrespective. But if ETH hold, then this long time limit just happens to give you the microcanonical answer.
Okay. And in the next slide, so you have some plot of.
Yes.
So what is this N1, N2?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I haven't gone through this. So essentially, what happens is that this was a plot of this density at two different sites. So it's a density correlation function.
Okay.
And it's plotted against its expectation is taken across these eigenstates. Okay. And it's plotted as a function of E. So this red, So this red thing corresponds to your non-integrable model, whereas the blue thing corresponds to this integrable model. So the red thing, as you see, is just a line Okay, and the width of this line depends on system size. So the larger system size that you get to, this line becomes narrower and narrower. Okay, and that is exactly what ETH predicts. Okay,
Okay.
that is going to be
So,
a function of, yeah.
so this N1 N2 average is for this Rydberg chain model or
No,
something
no, no. This is for
else?
a generic one-dimensional model. I just used it for
Just
illustration.
to show this ETH.
Yes. And this blue one thing is for an integrable model. So the same model with some potential turned off so that it becomes.
Mhm.
Other questions? Okay, if not, let's talk a little bit about these cars. Okay, so there is this. So scars are known in context of classical physics for a very long time, and one thing that you can think of is this billiard ball stuff. So you start with a billiard ball, and you have a rectangular potential like this with the ends in as a the cylinder. So this is typically called a stadium potential. It's Buninovic stadium essentially, and so what happens is that for most of the initial trajectories, most of the initial velocities in random directions, this trajectory, if you look at this, the trajectory of this ball, it's simply going to move on and exhaust cover all the space within the stadium. Okay. But clearly, there are some special trajectories. So, for example, if you let the ball move perpendicular to this rectangular part, then it's certainly not going to cover, the entire space. So, there are, for most initial condition, the trajectories over time spreads over the entire space in the stadium or the entire face space. But there are some special classical trajectories for which this is not the case. Okay. So, these are called classical scars. Now, the quantum mechanical version of this is why the name scar is justified. So, imagine that you have a quantum mechanical system, a Schrodinger equation, where the potential is this particular potential of this shape. Okay, so it's a hard one with this particular shape, and you try to in 2D, and you try to find out what happens to the probability of finding a particle given that you have some initial condition. Now it turns out that if your wave function, so you start with a Gaussian wave packet, typically in this kind of stuff, and if this Gaussian wave packet is centered at a classical orbit, which is Carl-like, you find that at long times, instead of filling out the phase space completely, the probability of the finding the particle is large in these darker regimes and small in the white regime, which essentially means that you have a scar-like pattern. There are some dark scars in the long time limit. So essentially, if you start from someplace else, that is your probability distribution could be a Gaussian wave packet, but not centered around the classical orbit. If it's centered around somewhere else, this would be a complete blur. Okay, so it will be completely uniform in the long time limit. But here it's not the case. So you see clearly that this kind of initial conditions, or in other words, initial starting states, do violate ergodicity in the sense that, in the long time, so this is of course a single particle quantum mechanics, but the point is that you come up with a non-uniform distribution at long times due to a presence of a special set of eigenfunctions whose probability amplitude peaks around these classical orbits. And these are called single particle quantum scars. Okay. So people have looked into this in the 80s and they have done some work on this. But the scars that we are talking about are many body scars in the sense that they are states in the Hilbert space of a many body system and in Fock space. Okay. So there are many examples where these scars are described. But what are these? In this context, these are defined as states which have finite energy density, but they are athermal. So what do I mean? So what I mean is the following. You see, if I look at a Hamiltonian, which is a standard local quantum mechanical many-body Hamiltonian, then the ground state and the first few excited state of this have zero energy density. So if you calculate their energy and you divide it by the system volume in the thermodynamic limit, you are going to get zero. However, this situation changes when you go to the mid-spectrum states, that is in the middle of the Hilbert space. Those are typically finite energy density eigenstates. So their energy essentially goes as the system dimension. Okay, so L to the power d essentially, so that their energy density is finite. Now, scars have finite energy density, but another thing that happens typically if you have a wave function with this kind of finite energy density, so imagine that you take this wave function and you create a density matrix by taking its outer product. Okay, so if you have a psi to be the wave function, you just take the outer product of psi itself, and this is a density matrix. And then you integrate over half of your chain, find out what's the entanglement of the rest half. Okay, so this is typically called the half chain entanglement entropy of a quantum state. So why does it have an entanglement entropy? Because you are summing over the half part of the chain, tracing them out, and therefore you are inducing entropy in the system. And that entropy for states which typically have finite energy density go as volume law, that is, it's proportional to the system dimension. And typically for ground states and states like this, it goes as area law, that is, it goes as L to the power d minus 1. Scars are anomalous states in the sense that they are finite energy density eigenstates which do not obey volume law entanglement entropy. Their entanglement entropy is much lower than the volume law. Okay, so here is a plot of this entanglement entropy as a function of energy. And you see in the mid spectrum, there is this bunch of states which is labeled as 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And these states, so 0 here is the mid spectrum. Okay, so these states essentially around the mid spectrum, they have much lower entanglement compared to rest of the states, which are here in the thermal band. Okay, so this is typically states which have volume law and they have large entanglement for a given L, and these have smaller entanglement. So these are these anomalous states which are called scars. And you see that there are only a few of them. And so if a starting state only has overlap with these, they move in a very restricted subspace, and therefore the dynamics could show long-term oscillations. Okay, so they do not really. So these scars, they do not really have significant overlap with any of these ETH obeying states. What I mean is that if you have a local Hamiltonian, you cannot really get an overlap between the scars and the other states in the Hilbert space during a time evolution. So, okay, so if that's the case, then what is happening here? So, what this is done by Dimitri Avanin's group, and there are few really nice papers about it. What they found is that if you look at the expectation value of this Z1, that is this Z, so forget about this Z1. So expectation value of of the operator, let's say a density correlation operator, with the scars out here, which you see out here, there are a lot which has a large overlap out here. Okay, these are given by these red dots, and these essentially are the thermal states with which the overlap is really small. So this red dot tells you states which have large overlap, and these are all stars. And therefore, they show that because you have a large overlap and because these scar states are anomalous, the density, therefore the dynamics essentially proceeds by making oscillations, and they do not thermalize, because the dynamics do not see the thermal states out here. Okay. So that is the explanation for why you have this long time oscillations, and that's the role of quantum stars behind these oscillations. Okay. So, any questions? Anything that I need to explain more?
So I have two questions. First thing is that, so you are considering in the middle of the spectrum. So what is the like? These scars are only valid for middle of the spectrum, because I can see in the plot that even for very low energy states like this zero, this
Low and high, right? So low and high.
yes, there are also there are all these points where the entanglement, and also the these values are have a almost equal spacing in some sense, like they
Yes,
comes in
that's a property of the model
like
here.
uh,
They do have equal spacing. That's
okay.
so that's a property
Okay.
of the model here. And
So the main question was this finite energy.
yeah, so the point is that look, I mean, the way when you start, so for example, you see that normally what happens is that the states which are at the bottom of your spectrum and at the top, both of these essentially are expected to have low entanglement, and if you have overlap with those, that's not going to produce thermal behavior. But in a typical situation, what happens is that you may have overlap with those, but you also have overlap with a lot of thermal states which are in the middle of the band during an evolution. Okay, so it's really the states in the middle of the spectrum which brings in this thermalization. However, in this case, what happens is that even
Sorry, there was some network connection problem, so I couldn't hear it.
can you hear
So
me now?
yes, now I can hear.
Yeah. So what is happening is that at the bottom or top of this spectrum, in both of these, there can be some overlap, but it is well known that these states anyway are not thermal. So in any dynamics, whenever there is thermalization, that happens due to overlap of the initial state with states in the middle.
Okay.
Now, here the main point is that even in the middle of the spectrum, it doesn't overlap with the thermal state. It overlaps only with these anomalous stars, and therefore this thermalization is entirely gone.
Okay.
Okay.
So so the ground states are very high energy states, like in the upper band. So they have some special property, so that they are like always athermal.
No, you see, there is this thing in one dimension. There is a theorem due to Hastings which tells you that the ground state of a local gapped Hamiltonian always have low entanglement area. Okay, and since you can just flip all the signs of your energy, all signs of your parameter to go from the lowest to the highest state, but that doesn't change the entanglement property. So you also see that the highest state also has the same property. It's only the state.
So this flipping of this sign of energy, so that depends on some symmetry of the Hamiltonian also.
No, you can just say that, okay, if I had a J and a V, let's say, okay, and I have a given E.
You just adjust the sign.
Yeah. So E would go to minus E immediately. Okay.
Yes.
So, any questions? Any other thing? Okay, if not, let me start with the other part. So, okay, so as I said, this overlap with the scars is what essentially gives you this long time oscillations. And so Avanin and others essentially simulated stuff. So they were simulating basically the density of Rydberg excitation, 1 plus n by 2. And you see that they see these long time oscillations when they start with the Z2 state. But the interesting thing is that look at the red line here. So if you don't start from the Z2 state where you don't have an overlap with the scars, then you see how fast you basically come to the steady state value. And this steady state value is what ETH predicts. Okay. So if you here this is done, if you start with all down states, that is no Rydberg excited state as your initial state, and here if you are starting with the Z2 state. So you see how remarkably different the dynamics would be because of the stars. Okay. So that's the quantum dynamics with stars. So this is all due to quench dynamics. So let me just now talk a bit about this model. So we already introduced this dipole model, so I'm not going to get into the details of this here. But the only thing that I want to say is that this dipole model is, yeah. Hello. Any questions or anything? Okay, so this dipole model can be directly mapped onto the spin model. Oops, sorry. Because dipole operator D can be written in terms of the spin language, and sigma z can be written in terms of these dipoles. Okay, so the only thing that I'm going to tell you today is that previously we had a constraint that you cannot have two spin-ups in this dipole model on adjacent sides. That can be implemented by a constraint like this. Okay, so by putting this projection, so that you can only flip a spin if the two sides are on site L, if the sites L minus 1 and L plus 1 is a downspin. So this PL eliminates the state if it is a upspin. You can see that is 1 minus sigma z L, and then the rest is that. And so this sigma tilde that I have put in is just this sigma x with this projection operators. Okay. Now the point is that why I am bringing this up here is that this provides an effective model for the Rydberg chain, because remember that this Rydberg chain has a sigma x and then there is a delta times n. So because sigma x is something like this, okay, so you have a sigma x here also, and this n is written in terms of this sigma z, so you can map this delta to lambda by 2 in this 2 model, okay, out here, up to a constant, of course. But now this Rydberg model has this Vij, Nir, Njr, and so if you make your Rydberg potential to be large enough so that you do not allow to have two Rydberg excitations on neighboring side, then you can simply replace this term by a constraint, and in that case, this model becomes exactly equal to the H spin that I'm talking about. Okay. So in the regime where this Rydberg excitation is large, provided there are two, this Rydberg interaction between Rydberg atoms is large, provided that the two atoms are at neighboring sites, then clearly the interaction can be replaced by a constraint, and in that limit, this model becomes exactly same as the model this dipole model. In the limit that you have this sigma x tilde and sigma z. Okay. So this is the model that we are going to look at, and this is also the model that Amanin and others looked at for describing the Rydberg atom dynamics. Okay, so that's the definition of the model. So any questions? Okay, so we already know the phase diagram of this, so I'm not going to get into the details of that. So let me just come into the dynamics of the correlation function. And here, what I'm going to do is to study a simple square pulse protocol where I'm going to drive the system by a periodic pulse. So in this model, where I had lambda, this essentially means the detuning of the Rydberg atoms. And what I'm going to do is to change this detuning to positive and negative at alternate half cycles. So lambda of t is plus lambda for the first half cycle, and it's minus lambda for the second half cycle. Okay. So and then I'm going to study the periodic dynamics of these things. Okay. So this periodic dynamics is best described in terms of the Fouquet-Hamiltonian. And to understand what that is, let me go through a very, I don't know what happened, so let me reshare. Okay, so I just want to give a very brief account of this Fluke physics, so that everybody is at the same page. Uh, yeah. So Fluke Hamiltonian is a property of systems which are driven periodically in time. Okay, so let's do a digression and let's just look at this Fluke stuff, and then I'm going to go through the actual system again. So what are these? These are driven systems, and typically, when you drive a system or when your Hamiltonian is time dependent in one way or the other, your system is determined by the unitary evolution operator, which is this exponential of the Hamiltonian, because these are formal solution of the time-dependent Schrodinger equation. However, because this Hamiltonian at different times do not commute with each other, this U of t needs to be time ordered. It cannot be just written in terms of, it cannot be written without this time ordering. What it means is that this time ordering essentially means that you break your system into evolution, tiny patches of time, so that, sorry, it should be much less than, so that this time window is much less than in any other system and generated time scale. Okay. And if that is the case, then you can take the product of the unitary evolution operator going from a time slice Tn to a Tn minus delta t. Okay, and you have to take all these products and then evaluate this. Okay, and you can imagine that this is not an easy task, and that is why calculating this evolution operator is so much problematic. Okay. So this time ordering essentially is what one of the major blocks for doing this analytically. However, there are certain protocols for which this time ordering can be tackled, and I'm going to come to this. But before that, now let's focus on the class of Hamiltonians which are periodic in time. So that a Hamiltonian repeats itself if you translate it by a period capital T, where T is the time period and it's given in terms of the driven drive frequency by 2 pi by omega t. Omega t is the drive frequency. So the statement, which was due to this Gaston Fluke in 1880s, I think, is that under such circumstances, the evolution operator at t equal to the time period or any multiple of it is essentially given by e to the power minus I hf t over h bar, where hf is the Fluke Hamiltonian, which is time independent and it depends only on the drive frequency. Okay. Now this thing can be proved by invoking what we know in condensed matter as the Bloch theorem, but Fluke did it much earlier. So we know that if there is a periodicity like this, here it's a periodicity in time, but suppose you are thinking of a lattice where there is a periodicity in space, then I could write my wave function as some e to the power I kx times uk of x, where uk of x is a periodic function. That's typically known as the Bloch theorem. Similarly here, you have periodicity in time. Therefore, you can write your evolution operator as something which is in terms of this quasi-energies or quasi-Hamiltonian, which is this Fluke Hamiltonian, a phase factor, times a function of time, which is periodic. So for n cycles of the drive, this is your stuff. Okay. This P essentially describes what is called a micromotion. That is the motion of the system between two time periods. And this e to the power minus IHF and T essentially tells you about the details of stroboscopic evolution. So if you only want to measure properties of the system at integer multiples of your drive period, that is stroboscopic measurement, then you are dealing only with this first phase factor. But note now that if I put capital T, if I go for 0 cycles and I also put small t to 0, then my evolution operator must be identity. Okay, up to a global phase which I disregard. Because your system is just starting and therefore the evolution operator must be identity. So just give me 1 second, sorry. So, sorry about that. So what happens then is that you basically know that P is 0, okay, because N is 0, this thing is 1, and therefore P0 must be 1. But I also know that P is a periodic function in time, okay, and therefore P(nt0), because we have translating this by n periods, must also be identity. So therefore, this tells you that ut0 must be e to the power minus I t by h bar. And therefore, if you are just doing stroboscopic measurement, then all the properties of the system can be determined in terms of the Fluke-Hamiltonian. So this is why calculating this Fluke-Hamiltonian is of importance in case of periodically driven systems. So is this part clear?
So the determining the Fluke-Hamiltonian is like, is it single valued, like, because it is
No, it offers, no, of course it's a phase, you see. So it goes from 2 pi over t, within that limit. Of course, it's not single valued, but the other values can be obtained by time translation, depending on this periodicity. So you just go into what is called the Fluke-Brillouin zone. You always stay within the first Brillouin zone. Okay. So remember, momentum is not single valued in that sense in Bloch theorem, right? So it's the same here.
Yes. Up to this P
Up to
by
the first
the
Brillouin zone.
yes.
So here you define the first Fluke zone or the
Yes.
Brillouin zone or whatever you call it, and then you just work with it.
Same analog. Yes.
Yeah, it's just the analog of Bloch theorem, which we know so well. This is just the same thing. So there it's a lattice translation, and therefore you have a quasi-momentum. Here is a time translation, and therefore you have a quasi-Hamiltonian or a quasi-energy. That's all. Okay, so now coming back to this drive, so what are the protocols for drives that we typically use? So there are two broad classes. One is these discrete protocols, where you break up your systems to have, H1 and H2 for two halves of the drive. This is called a square pulse protocol with periodicity T by 2. Sorry, periodicity T, and you break it in half. So there could be multiple protocols like this, but I'm just going to concentrate on this. And if you do that, you can see that the Fluke-Hamiltonian, because your evolution operator is just this, and for half the time it's e to the power minus h1, and the other half of the time it's e to the power minus h2. These are time independent, and therefore these U's commute with each other. And if you calculate this, you find that it's just a product of two exponentials. Now, remember that this h1 and h2 need not be commuting objects, so this hf can still be very complicated. Okay. And the second thing is that continuous protocols, where your Hamiltonian is explicitly time dependent, and these are much more difficult to have closed form expressions for. So I'm not going to get into much details of these continuous protocols, but these are much more difficult to study compared to the simultaneous. Now, how do you do this? So clearly doing this exactly is difficult, and that can be done only for very few systems. But typically people do perturbation. And one of the perturbation that people do is this so-called Magnus expansion, where you are in the limit where the drive frequency is large compared to all energy scales in the problem. And there you see, because the drive frequency is large, T is a small quantity compared to all other time scales in the problem. And therefore you can expand these exponentials on both sides. So if you just do the first order expansion, you see that this hf times t must be the integral of ht prime dt prime from 0 to p. And this tells you that the Fluke-Hamiltonian to first order is just the average Hamiltonian, time average of the Hamiltonian. And in second order, you come up with non-trivial commutators and so on. So you can do this step by step, okay? And the details of this has been recorded in different literature, and there are techniques for calculating this, and things get complicated and stuff like that. Okay? The advantage of this Magnus expansion is that, see, normally when I so U, of course, is unitary, right? So we know that U dagger U, because it's a closed quantum system, so the evolution operator must be unitary. But if you try to approximate U, then each term separately would not be unitary. The advantage of this Magnus expansion is this, that each term is unitary by itself, and therefore it gives you some computational advantage. Okay, you don't have to sort of worry about breaking unitarity and restoring them one way or the other. And the disadvantage of this is that it's a high frequency expansion, and it's accurate only at high frequencies, and there are instances where even at intermediate or moderate frequencies, it gives qualitatively wrong results. Okay, so you really cannot trust this thing as you come to intermediate frequency. But the worst thing is that you cannot really know for a given system what high frequency means in the context of Magnus expansion. So the radius of convergence of this Magnus expansion is a tricky issue. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but this was this indeed is a thing which has been talked about quite a lot in the research community. Okay. The other expansion which I'm going to use is slightly more complicated, but it has the advantage that it gives you correctly the physics at high and intermediate frequencies. Okay. So the first thing is that here what you do is something analogous to high amplitude expansion. So you divide the system so that it has a H naught, and for here I'm going to take H naught to be a function of t, but you could do the other way also. The distinction is that H naught is the larger term in Hamiltonian, which is exactly solvable, for which you know U naught exactly. Just by keeping H naught, you can calculate this U naught. Say this is exactly 1. And if that's the case, then the other things can be computed by a simple perturbation theory, time-dependent perturbation, as we do in our quantum mechanics. Okay. So, for example, from here, if you just calculate U1, you find that it's just one integral of this U naught dagger H1 U naught, and essentially this gives you HF1. Okay, after linearization. Now, the disadvantage of this is that it's more complicated than Magnus, and the second thing is that it's not unitary to all orders, so you need to unitarize it, by hand, which can be done in certain cases pretty straightforwardly, and I'm not going to get into the details of this complicated stuff. But the advantage of this is that it gives you a very accurate description which matches with exact numerics at intermediate frequencies. Okay. So this Fluke perturbation theory and the Magnus expansion is something that I'm going to talk about in context of the Rydberg chains, and therefore I just presented you with this, slight digression. Okay. So any questions regarding this? Okay, if not, let me go on. So here we will study a simple square pulse protocol, and as you see that for this square pulse protocol, I have this U, which is a product of two exponentials, just as I showed before, and this we can numerically compute by something called exact diagonalization, which computes this U numerically but exactly. Okay, for this Rydberg chain. This can be done, and I don't want to get into the details of this because I don't have much time. But the point is that by doing this, what we can do is that we can calculate this density-density correlation function exactly. Okay. And so what do we find? So what do we calculate? We drive the system with this square pulse protocol, and we want to find out the evolution of this correlation function as a function of stroboscopic time. Okay. And here is the result. So M here is the number of cycles of the stroboscopic time, and we start from the Z2 state in this Rydberg chain. So this when omega d is really large, what we find is that we find these long-term oscillations, and this is because in the large omega d limit, it's analogous to quench, and this is just a reproduction of Avanin's result. However, we also find that at small omega d, where the Fluke Hamiltonian is very complicated and Magnus expansion doesn't work, even when you start from this Z2 state, everything is thermal. Now, this is not a very strange result because, particularly because if you calculate the Fouquet Hamiltonian, as the frequency decreases, you need to keep more and more terms in your Magnus expansion, and your Fouquet Hamiltonian becomes a lot more complicated. And therefore, it is expected that such a complicated Hamiltonian is going to thermalize very fast because it's all connected, it's a very complicated mess, and any evolution there is going to be ETH obeying. Okay, so that's kind of expected. However, what is surprising here is that there are at omega d equal to 1.3, which is intermediate frequency, you find this ETH obeying behavior. But at a lower frequency, at omega d equal to 0.5, for example, you again see that this coherence is restored. Okay? And this is beyond the physics of quench, because this is something you cannot explain by just saying that your omega is large or small. So clearly there is a non-monotonic behavior as a function of omega. Okay? So I'm not going to get into this, but let me just explain what this is doing. Okay, out here. So excuse me for a second. Okay, so let me come here. So here, what happens is that we find that, so indeed, if we zoom in around this region, where there is this oscillations, okay, the first of these occurs around omega d equal to 8.25, and we take lambda to be 15, that's the drive amplitude, and W, which is this coefficient of this sigma x, to be 1. Okay, so you find that normally at high frequencies you see this oscillation which is consistent with Amanin star, but as we come near this frequency, which is roughly half of this lambda, these oscillations die down and you get into this steady state out here. Okay, so you restore ETH in some sense, and then as you go out of this frequency, you find that you have oscillations again. So it turns out that you can tune ergodicity of a many-body quantum system using a drive frequency, and we see several such transitions. So these dark regions are ones where you have thermal behavior, that is ETH is restored, and these white regions are the ones where you have athermal behavior or coherent oscillations. And you see as you go lower in frequency, the thermal regions increase, and at very low frequencies, they essentially cover the entire phase diagram, so you only have ergodicity. And at large enough frequency, you only have the thermal region. But in between, there are several re-entrant transitions between thermal and thermal stuff. Why does this happen? Okay, and this is the last thing that I'm going to say. So we tried to calculate this Fouquet Hamiltonian of this system, first by this Magnus expansion, which is something I'm not going to talk about, but then by this Fouquet perturbation theory, which is something I'm going to talk about, okay, because that gives you the stuff. So if I look at this Fouquet Hamiltonian at the calculations, what do? I know my drive amplitude is large, so this sigma z term is the part of the Hamiltonian I can keep to 0th order, and that gives me this simple looking U0, okay, which only depends on sigma z. So remember, so let me get into the Hamiltonian part. Yeah, so see here. So remember that if I just take this and I take lambda to be the driven term by a square pulse protocol, and that lambda is large, then to 0th order, my spin Hamiltonian would be just H0, is just this sigma z part. That's what I use to calculate U0. Okay. So if I do that, then this is my U0. And then you see that if I take states, if I level my states as the number of up spins, then between these two states, one with m up spins and one with n down spins, then I have this matrix elements for U0. So I can calculate this matrix element. And therefore, I can now calculate U1, where this H1 is, this H1, Hi is the Hamiltonian in the interaction picture. And this is the part of the Hamiltonian which has this sigma x. So it's u naught dagger, that sigma x term times u naught. Okay. So I can calculate this also, and after some manipulations, which I'm not going to get into the details of. So what I find is that my first order Fluke Hamiltonian has a term which is sine gamma by gamma times some oscillatory functions of sigma x tilde and sigma y tilde. Okay. So you see that this Fluke Hamiltonian is responsible. So this Hamiltonian is just like, so if you take a look at this Hamiltonian, you find that this term is not too different from this sigma x L tilde term with a rotation, of course. And also there, this W is renormalized with a factor of sine gamma by gamma. Okay. So these two are quite the same. And therefore at high frequencies, we come here. So at high frequencies where this gamma is lambda divided by this frequency, where this gamma is small, okay, then this HF1 is very close to the standard PXP model, okay, which is started with, and we get these oscillations exactly same for same reasons why Aban inside it, because the Fluke Hamiltonian is same as the Hamiltonian of their model. But now, as I lower this frequency, things get more complicated because there are third order terms and other things which come in, and clearly, you know, you are going to see this effect. But for intermediate frequency, this HF1 still dominates, and that's why for most of the regions you still have this coherent oscillations. However, when H1, when gamma goes to integer multiples of n, integer multiples of pi, that is at gamma equal to pi or 2 pi or 3 pi and stuff like that, you find that this HF1 vanishes. Okay, it's completely zero, which essentially means that your next contribution to the Fluke Hamiltonian comes from this third order term, which is a very complicated term. Okay, it has 3 sigma terms and stuff like that, and then there is H5 and all those. But the Fluke Hamiltonian is not the simple PXP term anymore. And therefore, this kind of Hamiltonian do not have scars in their spectrum, and they completely thermalize everything. Therefore, at these special frequency points, your Fluke Hamiltonian is thermal, but in other points they are non-thermal. And that's why you essentially have this transition from a coherent to a thermal part. Okay. And this is typically the behavior of a periodically given Rydberg chain, and this gives you the possibility of tuning algebraic properties of a many-body system by a drive frequency, which is not a straightforward thing in general. So I think I'm going to stop here because it's already 4:45 and I have covered enough in this lecture, I think. So let me summarize. So this entire course was of 2 parts. The first one was this topological. So the first one was about these topological materials, where we prepared systems like graphene topological insulators, you know, wild semi-metals, Majorana fermions, and stuff like that. So those are all in really, well, sort of condensed matter systems which you find in your laboratory. Most of them are given to you by nature, but you also fabricate some. And there, the main focus was on the topology of the ground state wave function, which brings in interesting problems and interesting properties to the systems which or to anything that is measured, like transport properties or edge states and stuff like that, Josephson effect, others. So, but we were restricted to essentially looking at the ground state of a quantum many-body system and mostly non-interactive. In the second part, we moved to the other feature where you could manufacture these systems and you could look into which are interacting, and you could, and sometimes strongly interacting, and you could look into not only their ground state but also to their entire spectrum of states in the Hilbert space. Okay, so this is normally not possible in natural condensed matter systems because they interact with the environment, and any quantumness in response, like oscillations, etc., they die down very fast. But with these cold atom systems, this is not the case. And here you can design these really nice emulators of quantum models, strongly correlated models, which people have tried to understand in the context of natural systems for long times. Okay. And as far as the dynamics is concerned, I'm sure this is just the tip of the iceberg. We are only just beginning to understand, the structure of states in the Hilbert space of a many-body system. Whereas we focus just on the ground state and the first few excited state for so long. Now is the time to get into the entire Hilbert space. And that's one of the major direction of work in recent condensed matter community. And also understanding topology in this interacting system is another direction that people are looking into. So with this, I think I'm going to end this lecture and this set of lectures. I really thank you for listening to them patiently, and I'm really sorry if something is unclear. It would have been much better if this was a Blackboard talk. But thank you for your patience and listening, and thank you. Okay, so I stop here.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Krishnendu, for this wonderful series. On behalf of IIT Gandhinagar, our faculty members, we express our gratitude that you have agreed to give this seminar series. And we will now, all the lectures are now uploaded except this one. So we will upload this one. And we hope that later also, if there is any expanded version of the course, we will have you similar to this one.
Yeah, I would really like to sort of do this on Blackboard,
Yeah.
So I feel that there might be a lot of, so communicating ideas over the internet is a difficult thing, even at this juncture. I'm not entirely confident with that, but at some point, if I could do this over the Blackboard, I would be very happy to do that.
So Prasanna is also here. Prasanna, you want to say something? Yeah.
Oh no, I thanks, Krishnendu, and then we hope to have you here sometime. I actually had a question on the physics.
Okay, please.
I think that's easier.
You can take all the questions that you have, no problem. Yeah.
So I was, yeah. Sorry. No. This is somewhat. So if since now you're looking with these Floquet versions of the Rydberg arrays, now, isn't the surprising thing in this case the fact that you can have even thermalization? Because this is a driven system. It's not like a system where you just quench and you leave things go.
It's not, well, it might come as a surprise, but the point is this fact is known. In the sense that if you take a Fluke Hamiltonian, there are some works by Marcus Trial and others, which showed that the Fluke isostates, also satisfy an ETH of some sort.
Okay.
So I glossed over that, but the point is that that is very well known. So typically you expect thermalization. Yeah.
I see. And also these scar many body eigenstates. So you were saying that it's very hard to say what are the ingredients that will in a many body Hamiltonian that will generically lead to quantum scars, right? So where is the understanding on it right now? Are there some ingredients that is one can say that okay, you have to have a
so essentially I think one so I'm a bit hazy on that because I don't know if there is any direct statement of having so if I give you a Hamiltonian, can you tell me without doing any calculation would there be scars in it? That I don't really know, but there are certain properties that people expect. So, for example, this is hard to say, but so for example, this has been seen in other models like the AKLT model. There is a structure, an emergent SU2 symmetry which comes in next to this curve. So, some kind of emergent symmetry is one of the requirements, but it's not essential because the PXP model, for example, do not have that. It has an approximate emerging symmetry, but not the full part of it. Okay. The other thing that I would say is that it also has to do with how connected your Hilbert space is, because it's again, okay, so let me try to make clear what I mean. So imagine that you have a quantum Hamiltonian and you have a set of states in your Hilbert space. Okay.
Mhm.
Then under the action of this quantum Hamiltonian, you can think of a connectivity graph between these different states.
Mhm.
Which means that under the action of this Hamiltonian on any given state in the Fock basis, you will go to other states in the Fock basis. Okay?
Mhm.
So typically ergodic systems are the ones where this connectivity graphs basically in the thermodynamic limit has only one such blob which is all connected.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay, but in many cases these are fragmented, and if this fragmentation survive in the thermodynamic limit,
Mhm.
which is called strong fragmentation, then clearly, if you start in a state which is within a small fragment,
Mhm.
you are not going to get into the other fragment, and then the dynamics is going to give you this car-like behavior.
Mhm.
Okay,
Mhm.
so that's a sufficient condition, but that again is not a necessary condition.
I see. I see.
So there is something called weak fragmentation, where you could have these fragmented things, but in the thermodynamic limit, the number of states in the lower fragments go to zero.
Okay.
In the sense that the ratio of this number of states to the total number of states in the system, they go to zero with them. Those, I think, are the cases of scarce.
I see.
So it's very hard to say a priori without looking at this connectivity graph, whether or
Okay.
not a thing is going to have anything different
see.
from RDS.
So I guess I was also thinking of it in a much more. The question was somewhat more innocent in the sense that if I wanted to write down Hamiltonians that might end up supporting this quantum scars, now the idea is you start from similar Hamiltonians to the ones that you wrote and AKLT and then look.
Yeah.
So there is no sort of a simple roadmap that, okay, how do I write down a Hamiltonian?
I would just say not that I know of, but
Okay.
I'm not an active SCAR guy, so there might be tricks that people understand which hasn't been communicated.
I have a bad joke for you. You're not a scary guy.
Yeah.
So there was another question about how one could this car business sounds a little bit like when you have some in a many body dissipative systems.
Yes.
Sometimes you can actually have states, at least in atomic physics, sometimes these are called dark or subradiant states, which are dissipation free, or decoherence free. So now is it possible to and there it is actually a steady state in the Hilbert space. So it is in principle they are mostly always pure, so they are not some mixed density matrix as well.
Sure.
So I was wondering if there is some way to sort of maybe understand just as in these sort of ETH type things where you can understand the system, the rest of the system as forming some kind of a bath for local degrees of freedom. Can one use some such technique to understand these scars in some anticipative language?
I mean, in principle, yes, but the point is that what happens is that typically, so I don't know these states very well, but typically, I know that this kind of things are seen in standard bosonic language. Right? In case of boson, superfluids, and then you do stuff to it and stuff.
Sure.
The problem there is that there is nothing mid spectrum because the Hilbert space is infinite in some sense. Because it's bosons, you see. So
actually, it is interesting. So the ones I was thinking of was with two-level systems. So they are actually fermionic with atoms.
So brushing that aside.
Okay.
So let's say that I have this kind of systems, and then I know, in some sense, at least within a finite size system, the whole Hilbert space. Then what the first thing I would do is to look at these states, and try to compute their half-chain entanglement. So if it turns out that, and their energy density, okay. So if it turns out that the energy density of these states as well is, obeys a volume law, that is, they have finite energy density, but they have an entanglement which is sufficiently smaller than the rest. Okay, then I would say that it's a representation.
I see.
Scar-like representation. So if the states are anomalous, there must be a reason why it is anomalous. That's the thing to find. And one way to do it is to do this entanglement, which many people have done. So that's the one thing. And the second thing that I would like to point out is that this cars might be there in many other models. The point is why we haven't seen it so far is that it's not always easy to prepare an initial state which is an overlap with these cars, and therefore dynamics more often than not doesn't show their presence. Okay. So this Rydberg atom chain is unique in that way that you can prepare a very simple, almost classical state,
Right.
which is a big overlap with these car states.
Right.
Okay, so that's
Yeah. I mean, I think this is at least for these sub-radiant states that I'm talking about. Again, these are extremely hard to prepare, especially as if you have the number of individual qubits. If it becomes larger, this is a fairly highly entangled state. So if you have to prepare it, it's impossible to prepare in any simple manner.
I see.
It's also even in this system. This is a problem. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. So this is the end of the story, okay, for this course. And we again thank Krishnendu. And also
Thank you,
thank
everyone.
all the,
Have a nice weekend. Yep.
and we should also thank the participants who have at the end of it stayed.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Krishnendu, bye.
Okay, bye.